story of Goo Lagoon begins not with noise nor with excitement, but with silence. Long before crowds filled the beach, long before volleyballs sailed across the sand, the lagoon existed as something ancient and quiet. It was a wide stretch of water, resting softly under the endless sea above. Its surface glowed faintly, a pale sheen that mirrored the drifting sunlight. From afar, it looked almost still, so still that a fish could mistake it for a sheet of glass. But if one drifted closer, they would see the gentle movement of waves, not the crashing, rolling waves of the open ocean, but soft ripples, flowing in smooth circles that reached the shore with a sigh. Each wave seemed to take its time, moving without hurry, as though the lagoon itself knew there was no need to rush. It was patient, timeless, and endlessly calm. The waters of Goo Lagoon were different from the waters of the deep sea. They were lighter, easier, almost playful in the way they carried anything that touched them. A pebble tossed into the lagoon would sink slowly, swaying as it went down, as if the water wanted to cradle it before letting it rest on the sand below. Even the smallest bubble would drift upward without bursting until it finally kissed the surface. At the edges of the lagoon, the sand was soft and pale, spread out like a giant blanket beneath the gentle waves. When the tide washed over it, the grains of sand shimmered faintly, catching the glow of the filtered sunlight. Each step on that sand left a mark that faded slowly, as though the beach itself wanted to hold on to the memory a little longer before letting it go. Ainan owl, small shells lay scattered across the shore, carried by the water from faraway places. Some were tiny and delicate, almost transparent, while others curled in spirals of pale pink and creamy white. They rested silently, half buried in the sand, waiting for the next wave to shift them just a little closer to the water. When the breeze drifted across the lagoon, it sometimes made the shells hum in the faintest notes, like a hidden song only the sand could hear. Seaweed swayed gently beneath the water's surface, stretching out in long ribbons of green and gold. They did not rush with the tide nor fight against it, but moved gracefully back and forth as though dancing to a song that had been playing since the beginning of time. Fish would sometimes weave in and out of these swaying plants, moving slowly as if they too had learned the lagoon's rhythm of patience. During the day, Goo Lagoon basked in soft, filtered light. The water shimmered in shades of blue and turquoise, with a hint of silver sparkling across its surface. Sometimes beams of sunlight would pass through the water at just the right angle, painting streaks of gold on the sand below. It was as though the lagoon had its own quiet gallery, showing pictures that only the patient could see. But it was during the night that Goo Lagoon revealed its most magical face. When the sky above darkened and the great ocean grew still, the lagoon would come alive with tiny points of light. Plankton floated quietly in the water, glowing faintly with every movement. A ripple across the lagoon sent shimmers of blue and green drifting outward, spreading like stars across the surface. It was as if the sky had fallen to the water and the lagoon had become a mirror of the universe. In those moments, the lagoon was more than a body of water. It was a dream. The quiet hum of the ocean around it, the gentle swaying of plants, the tiny flickers of glowing light, all came together to create a place that felt safe, soft, and eternal. If one listened closely, they could almost hear the water's heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing like a lullaby. For years, Goo Lagoon remained untouched. Few creatures knew of it, and fewer still visited its shores. It was not hidden, but it was humble. It did not call for attention, nor try to impress. It simply existed, steady and serene, like an old friend waiting patiently for company. And so, for a long time, the lagoon remained a secret place of rest. Those who stumbled upon it often felt something they could not explain. A tired swimmer might feel lighter as soon as they entered the water, as though the lagoon itself wanted to carry their weight. A wandering fish might pause and rest near the surface, finding comfort in the way the currents cradled it. Even the smallest crab crossing the sand seemed to slow its steps, taking its time as though the beach had taught it to move more gently. The calm waters of Goo Lagoon were not just peaceful, they were healing. Every ripple seemed to wash away the noise of the world. Every wave seemed to whisper that everything would be all right. Time did not move the same way here. It stretched, softened, and unfolded slowly, like a story told just before sleep. As the years passed, the lagoon continued to rest in its stillness, untouched by crowds, free of noise, waiting for the day when it would become more than a secret. But in those early times, it was enough for the lagoon to simply be what it was, a cradle of calm, a mirror of the stars, and a place where silence itself felt alive. The lagoon's stillness had a way of making even the busiest mind slow down. If you floated on its surface, you would find yourself drifting without effort, your body rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of the waves. It was almost as if the lagoon were breathing, exhaling softly as it lifted you up, then inhaling again as you sank back down. The motion was so subtle that minutes could feel like hours, and hours could slip away without notice. At the edges of the water, tiny creatures lived quietly. Small snails crept along the sand, leaving thin trails behind them that vanished when the tide rolled in. Starfish rested lazily, spread out like painted flowers pressed onto the seafloor. Occasionally, a jellyfish would wander close, its translucent body glowing faintly as it pulsed along. Even it seemed slower here, as though the lagoon's calm had wrapped itself around its movements. Above the surface, seabirds would sometimes glide in slow circles. They rarely cried out, as if the hush of the lagoon asked them to keep their voices soft. Now and then one would dive gracefully into the water, sending a ripple across the surface that spread wide before fading back into stillness. Each ripple seemed to take its time before disappearing, like a note that lingered in the air long after the song had ended. When the tides shifted, the lagoon did not resist. The open ocean outside might grow restless, its waves growing taller and louder. But Goo Lagoon remained steady, as though it had learned how to hold its own peace. The water lifted and lowered, but it never rushed, never roared. The lagoon's nature was not to fight, but to embrace. Every change, every movement, every shift was absorbed and softened until even the wildest tide was calmed. There was something ancient in that calmness. The lagoon had been there long before any visitors set foot on its sand. It had watched the turning of countless days and nights, the drift of seasons, the quiet passing of years. The world outside might have hurried forward, but inside the lagoon, time always seemed to walk instead of run. Some believed that this was the true gifts of Goo Lagoon, not its beauty, not its glow, but its patience. On certain evenings, when the sun began to sink and the light turned golden, the lagoon seemed to sigh with relief. The waves slowed even further, and the water reflected the sky like a perfect mirror. You could not tell where the horizon ended and where the sea began. The entire world seemed to blur into one endless sheet of color. To stand at its shore, then, was to stand inside a painting, one brushed by the softest hands. And as night crept in, the lagoon welcomed it with open arms. Shadows lengthened, Stars twinkled above, and the glowing plankton below flickered brighter. The water looked alive with scattered lights, as though thousands of lanterns had been gently placed on the surface. Sometimes the glow drifted in clusters, creating the shape of constellations in the water that matched those in the sky. It was as if the lagoon wanted to remind anyone watching that dreams lived both above and below. Silence deepened with the night, but it was never empty. The soft sounds of the lagoon filled the air, the hush of water sliding over sand, the faint crackle of tiny bubbles breaking, the whisper of seaweed brushing against itself. These were not loud sounds, nor were they meant to be noticed all at once. They were background notes, like the gentle hum of a lullaby. Together, they formed a music that could only be heard if one was willing to listen closely, patiently, and slowly. Sometimes, drifting currents brought gifts from faraway places. A piece of coral might tumble into the lagoon, polished smooth by its journey. A pearl might roll along the sand until it came to rest in the shallows. Even driftwood found its way here, resting on the beach like a memory of distant waters. The lagoon welcomed them all, never questioning, never pushing them away. Everything that arrived became part of its quiet story. There were moments, too, when the sky above seemed to lean as though it wanted to rest by the lagoon's side. Painted with pale colors, and the moon sometimes lingered a little longer, hanging low as if reluctant to leave. The lagoon, in return, reflected it all with perfect stillness. In those moments, water and sky were companions, sharing a silence that needed no words. To walk along the lagoon's edge was to feel this companionship. The sand was always cool, shaped by the waves into smooth patterns that shifted each day but never lost their softness. Every step seemed to sink a little deeper, as though the earth itself wanted to cradle your feet. And as you walked, the sound of the water followed you, keeping pace with your steps like a gentle friend at your side. The lagoon did not seek to impress. It did not roar with waterfalls or glitter with jewels. Its beauty was not loud but tender, like the comfort of a soft blanket or the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. It was not a place that demanded your attention, but one that quietly invited it. If you stopped, if you slowed, if you listened, you would understand. And so Goo Lagoon remained what it had always been, a sanctuary of stillness, a keeper of peace, a mirror of the sky and a cradle for the weary. Its calm waters waited patiently, as if they knew that someday more would come. But for now, in those quiet beginnings, it was enough simply to be, a place of endless rest, where silence itself felt alive. The lagoon had a way of reminding anyone who lingered by its shores that not everything in the world needed to move quickly. The outside ocean was full of urgency. Currents racing, waves crashing, storms arriving without warning. But Goo Lagoon resisted all of that. It was a place where movement slowed, where every ripple seemed to pause and breathe, as though even the water itself had learned the art of patience. You sit on the sand, your toes brushing against the shallow water. The waves roll forward just enough to touch your skin and then drift back again with a sigh. Over and over, they repeat this gentle greeting, never hurried, never harsh. You begin to notice that the rhythm is steady, like the beating of a calm heart. If you close your eyes, the sound becomes a song, soft, repetitive, reassuring. It tells you that nothing here is urgent. Nothing here demands more than your stillness. Further out in the lagoon, the water deepens, but the calm never breaks. It is not an emptiness, but a fullness of peace. Schools of fish glide quietly, each one moving in unison without a splash. Their scales catch the light in faint glimmers, like threads of silver stitching across a blue fabric. When they turn, it is slow and smooth, so seamless it feels like the water itself is guiding them. The lagoon is not just their home, it is their teacher, showing them how to move without haste. In the distance, the surface sometimes sparkles with the sudden flashes. These are not storms nor signs of disturbance, but the dance of sunlight as it passes through the water. The light shifts and bends, creating shapes that drift and fade like soft brushstrokes on a canvas. At times, the lagoon seems to be painting pictures only it understands, shapes of waves, circles of brightness, shadows that stretch and vanish. Each painting lasts only a moment before another takes its place, a gallery of fleeting art shown only to those willing to sit still and watch. The lagoon also carries a voice, though it is never loud. It is the voice of water gliding across sand, of bubbles rising slowly, of seaweed swaying against the current. If you lean close enough, you hear it not as separate sounds, but as one soft whisper. It is a language too quiet for words, a murmur of the sea itself. Some say it is the lagoon speaking directly, not to be understood by the mind, but to be felt in the heart. There were times, even in those earliest days, when the lagoon seemed to cradle the whole world. A gentle fog might drift across the surface in the early morning, wrapping everything in a pale mist. The horizon would disappear, and for a while, all you could see was the silver of the water beneath and the soft veil of mist above. It felt like being inside a dream, one where boundaries vanished and time slowed until it nearly stopped. In that fog, you could sit for what felt like minutes and realize that hours had passed, the lagoon carrying you quietly through time as if it knew you needed the rest. Small creatures made the lagoon their home long before visitors arrived. Tiny crabs scuttled along the sand, their shells patterned with soft swirls of brown and white. They dug little holes, disappearing into the earth only to reappear again, cautious yet curious. Sea anemones waved their delicate arms from the shallow rocks, their colors glowing faintly when the light touched them. Even the smallest fish found safety in the gentle shallows, darting playfully between the swaying ribbons of seaweed. Each one seemed to belong, as if the lagoon had been made for them, and they for it. And at night, when the world grew quiet, the lagoon revealed its secret beauty once more. The bioluminescent plankton shimmered with every touch, turning the water into a field of stars. A single step into the lagoon would light up a trail of glowing blue, fading slowly behind you. To float in that water was to float among the stars themselves, above and below, as though you had been carried into the heart of the universe. The glow was gentle, never harsh, a soft reminder that even in darkness there was beauty. The sky seemed to join in the lagoon's calm. Stars stretched wide overhead, reflected in the water below. If you lay on the sand and looked out, you might feel as though you were lying between two skies, one above and one below, both stretching into forever. The air was cool. The water hummed softly, and the world around you seemed to exhale. Sleep came easily here, not because you sought it, but because the lagoon's calm invited it. Every creature, every ripple, every sound was part of the same slow rhythm. The lagoon did not rush, and so nothing in it rushed either. Even the passing of night into morning seemed unhurried. The stars slowly faded, the water slowly brightened, the mist slowly lifted. Dawn arrived not with a burst of light, but with a quiet unfolding, as though the day was being gently unwrapped. The lagoon welcomed it without resistance, shimmering once more under the soft golden sun. In this way, Goo Lagoon's calm waters shaped the world around them. They taught patience to the restless, rest to the weary, and quiet to the loud. And though its story had only just begun, already the lagoon was something special. More than water, more than sand. It was a keeper of peace, waiting to be discovered, waiting to cradle those who needed it most. The calm of Goo Lagoon was not fragile. It was strong, steady, and unbroken, as though the water carried within it a memory of every quiet moment that had ever passed. It had seen countless dawns, each one slow and golden. It had seen endless nights, each one soft and star-filled. It had endured storms, too, moments when winds roared and waves crashed. But even then, the lagoon returned to calm, as though it could not forget its true nature. The storms might shake it, but never change it. Its stillness was more than a moment. It was a promise. There was a comfort in knowing that no matter how the world outside shifted, Goo Lagoon would remain. Creatures sensed this. The crabs that dug in the sand, the fish that drifted in its shallows, even the birds that glided overhead, they all seemed to trust the lagoon. They moved slowly here, rested longer here, and allowed themselves to simply be. It was as if the lagoon whispered to them, "You are safe. You are home." On certain afternoons, the water carried a different kind of light. The sun, high above the sea, would filter down in beams that seemed almost solid. They cut through the water in long golden pillars, illuminating the sand below. If you looked closely, you might see dust-like specks drifting in the beams, floating endlessly as if caught in a dream. These specks were not in a hurry to rise or sink. They simply drifted, suspended in the quiet. And so the lagoon became a place where even the smallest particle seemed unhurried, where everything moved in its own time. The air above was just as gentle. Breezes moved lightly across the water, carrying the faint scent of salt and the freshness of the sea. They brushed the surface, leaving faint ripples. They had come. Sometimes the wind carried with it a hush, like a sigh of the ocean far away. The lagoon caught that sigh and held it, softening it until it became part of its own voice. Every corner of the lagoon seemed to hold a secret. Beneath smooth rocks, small fish rested. In hidden pockets of sand, tiny clams opened and closed with the rhythm of the waves. Shallow pools at the edge reflected the sky like polished glass, while deeper waters seemed to stretch forever, their depths fading into quiet mystery. To explore the lagoon was to wander through a world that was both simple and endless, a place where each discovery was gentle, never startling, never rushed. Found their way to the lagoon, often described it in whispers, as though speaking too loudly might disturb it. They told stories of how the water felt softer here, how the sand seemed smoother, how even their thoughts grew lighter when they floated on its surface. Some believed the lagoon had a heart, a slow and steady one that beat beneath the waves. They said that if you rested long enough, your own heart might fall into the same rhythm, and you would carry that calm with you wherever you went. The nights were perhaps the lagoon's most treasured gift. When darkness spread across the sea and silence deepened, Goo Lagoon became a world of stars. The plankton glowed with every movement, scattering trails of blue-green light across the water. Each ripple lit up like a falling star, fading gently until the next one appeared. To float in the lagoon at night was to drift in the middle of the cosmos, the stars above and below wrapping you in their endless embrace. It was difficult to tell where the sky ended and the water began. In that blending, the world felt whole, complete, and boundless. And always the lagoon remained gentle. It did not demand attention, nor did it ever lose its patience. It was simply there, holding its stillness like a gift, waiting for anyone who needed it. Its calmness was not just for the sea creatures, nor just for the stars reflected above. It was for every heart that wandered near, every soul that longed for quiet. The lagoon's calm waters held a story even then, though no one had yet written it down. It was the story of patience, of time slowed, of silence treasured. It was the story of a place that cradled all who came to it, whether they were fish, birds, or dreamers floating on the surface. And though more stories would come, stories of laughter, of games, of gatherings, the first chapter was always this: a chapter of stillness. Goo Lagoon's history began not with people, not with crowds, not with noise. It began with calm. It began with quiet. It began with waters so gentle they could carry not only a swimmer's body, but their thoughts, their worries, their weariness. It began as a cradle of peace, resting patiently beneath the endless sea. And so the lagoon waited. It waited through days of sunlight, through nights of glowing plankton, through storms and breezes, through the passing of seasons. It waited without hurry, without longing, without need. For the lagoon knew that in time, more would come. Visitors would arrive. Stories would be made. Laughter would fill the air. But before all of that, there was this. The calm waters of Goo Lagoon had existed for ages, unbroken and patient. But nothing stays hidden forever, not even a place so quiet and humble. One day, after countless dawns and sunsets had passed, the lagoon received its very first visitors. They were not many, and they did not arrive with noise or fanfare. They came slowly, curiously, guided by whispers carried through the sea. Somewhere, it was said, there was a body of water where the waves were soft, where the current was kind, where rest could be found without effort. At first, these whispers were only stories. Rumors passed between wandering fish, drifting shells, and seabirds flying above. But curiosity is patient too, and in time, small groups of creatures began to seek the place for themselves. The first to arrive were families of sea creatures traveling together. They had wandered long distances searching for food and safety, moving through waters that sometimes pulled too hard, pushed too strong, or grew too dark. When they finally reached Goo Lagoon, they stopped. For the first time in their long journey, the water did not fight them. It did not pull them forward nor push them back. It simply held them, steady and warm, as though welcoming them home. The children of these families were the first to notice the difference. They darted into the shallows, expecting to sink or tumble the way they did in the open sea. Instead, they found themselves lifted effortlessly, floating with ease on the lagoon's gentle surface. Their laughter echoed across the calm waters, soft and surprised. They splashed and drifted, bobbing up and down like small bubbles caught in the tide. To them, it felt like magic, water that did not challenge but embraced. Their parents, weary from their travels, moved more carefully. They rested at the edges of the shore, settling into the smooth sand. The ground beneath them was softer than any they had known, shaped perfectly by the waves into gentle slopes. They stretched out, feeling the lagoon cradle their bodies with every movement of the tide. It was unlike anything they had felt before. Here they were not pulled in every direction, not worn down by restless currents. Here they were allowed to pause. Days turned into nights, and the families remained. At sunset, they watched as the lagoon transformed into a mirror of the sky glowing with fading light. At night, they saw the plankton sparkle, their soft glow surrounding the children as they played. It was a sight so gentle, so comforting, that the families began to tell each other stories. They spoke of how the lagoon seemed alive, how it held them like a parent holds a child, how it welcomed them without question. Some whispered that the lagoon was not only water, but a guardian of peace. When morning came, they found it difficult to leave. They had known the wild seas, the harsh tides, the endless search for rest. But here, everything was different. The lagoon seemed to invite them to stay, not with words, but with its calm. So they remained a little longer. And the longer they stayed, the more they understood that they had found something rare, something worth returning to. As they finally drifted away, carrying with them the memory of their time at Goo Lagoon, they shared their stories with others. They told of a place where children could float without fear, where parents could rest without worry, where nights sparkled with stars above and below. Their voices were filled with wonder, and those who listened felt a longing awaken in them. Soon more families began to follow, seeking this quiet treasure of the sea. The next visitors arrived more quickly. Word of the lagoon spread slowly but steadily, passed along currents and carried in songs. Creatures who had never met each other before now shared the same destination, guided by hope for rest. Some came in pairs, some in groups, some alone. Each one arrived with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Would the stories be true? Would the lagoon truly hold them so gently? When they reached the water, their questions melted away. The moment they stepped into the lagoon, they felt the difference. Their bodies grew lighter, their breaths slowed, their hearts softened. It was as though the lagoon had been waiting for them, patient and unchanging, ready to offer its calm. The children floated again, their laughter soft and echoing. The adults lay in the sand, their eyes half closed, their worries slipping away with every ripple of the tide. Even the quietest visitors, the crabs, the small fish, the starfish, seemed to find their places here, moving more slowly, more gently, as if they too understood the gift they had found. It was in these early days that Goo Lagoon became more than a body of water. It became a gathering place, not yet crowded, not yet filled with games and noise, but a place where lives intersected, where travelers found comfort together. They met at the water's edge, shared stories of their journeys, and rested side by side. The lagoon did not just hold individuals, it brought them together. For the first visitors, the lagoon was more than a discovery. It was a promise, a reminder that somewhere in the wide, restless sea, there was a place that cared for them. They carried this promise with them when they left, and each time they returned, it grew stronger. The lagoon, once silent and hidden, had begun to speak, not with words, but with calmness that echoed in every heart that entered its waters. As more creatures discovered Goo Lagoon, the stories of its waters began to weave together like threads in a tapestry. Each visitor carried with them a memory, and each memory was added to the quiet history of the place. The lagoon had been empty for so long, known only to itself and to the stars above. Now, with each new family that arrived, its story began to take shape. One of the earliest visitors was a gentle old turtle. He had lived through many tides, and his shell carried the marks of storms, scratches and scars from long travels across the sea. He had heard whispers of the lagoon from younger creatures who passed him on their journeys. At first he had not believed them. He thought it was simply a tale told to comfort restless travelers. But curiosity is as old as the sea itself, and one day he turned his slow steps toward the place he had heard so much about. When he finally reached Goo Lagoon, he stopped at its edge and waited. He had walked through the countless shores, but none had felt like this. The sand was soft, almost glowing, and the water shimmered with a stillness he had never seen. With careful movements, he slid into the shallows. At once he felt lighter. The water lifted him, held him, carried him without effort. The old turtle closed his eyes, letting the lagoon rock him back and forth, and for the first time in many years he felt as though he could rest. The children who were playing nearby swam up to greet him. They circled around his great shell, laughing softly, delighted by his presence. The turtle opened his eyes and smiled, realizing that the lagoon was not only a gift to him, but to all who entered. It was a place where generations could meet, where the young could play and the old could heal. Word of his visit spread quickly. Creatures spoke of how the wise turtle had found peace in the lagoon's waters, how his heavy shell seemed lighter, how his tired eyes had grown calm again. For many, his story was proof that Goo Lagoon was not only a place of play, but of renewal, and so more came. Families brought their children. Wanderers brought their weary bodies. Even those who rarely left their hidden corners of the sea began to drift toward this quiet sanctuary. With each new arrival, the lagoon remained unchanged. Its water stayed soft, its tides stayed slow, its glow stayed constant. It seemed never to tire, never to resist, as though it had been waiting all along. The visitors noticed this, and they began to speak of the lagoon as something more than a place. They began to speak of it as a friend. Some said the lagoon listened. When you floated on its surface and let your mind grow quiet, you could almost feel it paying attention to your thoughts, holding them gently without judgment. Others said it remembered. They claimed that when they returned, the water felt warmer, as though it recognized them. Whether these stories were true or only the imaginings of grateful hearts, no one could say for certain. But everyone agreed that Goo Lagoon was not just water and sand. It was something deeper, something alive in its stillness. The gatherings grew slowly. At first, only a handful of families would meet at the shore, sharing food and laughter under the sun. They told each other tales of their journeys, stories of storms survived, treasures found, and lessons learned. The lagoon was their backdrop, steady and calm, as they passed their words from one to another. At night, when the glowing plankton shimmered, they would sit in the shallows and watch the water light up around them. Their voices falling quieter as sleep drew near. The children began to form their own traditions. They collected shells from the sand, lining them in patterns that marked the places they had sat. They floated together in small circles, holding hands and watching the sky reflected below them. Sometimes they buried their toes in the soft sand until the tide washed over them, giggling as the water tickled their feet. These small games were not yet the great gatherings the lagoon would one day know, but they were the seeds of what was to come. Even the smallest details of the lagoon became treasures to the visitors. The way the sunlight sparkled on the ripples in the morning, the way the mist curled over the water at dawn, the way the air smelled faintly of salt and warmth when the breeze passed by. These were not grand things, not loud or overwhelming. They were gentle, subtle, and easy to overlook. But for the visitors, and they were precious, for they belonged to the lagoon alone. Time did not move quickly here. Days stretched longer, and nights passed like dreams. The visitors often stayed far longer than they planned, forgetting the urgency of their travels, the busyness of the ocean outside. Goo Lagoon taught them to pause, to breathe, to rest. And when they left, they carried this lesson with them, as though a part of the lagoon traveled with them wherever they went. In these earliest days, Goo Lagoon began to weave itself into the hearts of all who came. The families who floated in its waters, the wanderers who found comfort on its shores, the children who laughed in its shallows, even the old turtle who had thought his days of discovery were over. They all became part of its growing story. And though they would one day be joined by many more, these first visitors would always be remembered as the ones who gave the lagoon its first voice. As the lagoon welcomed more visitors, it began to take on a rhythm of its own, a rhythm shaped not only by the tides, but by the lives that gathered along its edge. Each day, the water seemed to invite the same gentle cycle. Mornings of discovery, afternoons of play, evenings of quiet reflection. The lagoon became a silent partner in these moments, offering its calm surface to cradle whatever the day brought. One early morning, when the sky above the sea was still painted in soft lavender and pale gold, a family of starfish came to the lagoon. They moved slowly, their small arms stretching outward as they made their way across the sand. Though they were creatures of patience and stillness, they had heard from passing neighbors that Goo Lagoon held something different, something worth seeing with their own eyes. When they reached the water, the youngest among them slipped carefully into the shallows. To their surprise, they didn't sink quickly as they would have in the deeper ocean. Instead, the lagoon held them near the surface, almost as if it wanted them to float. The young starfish spread out its arms, tilting slightly, and giggled with a sound like bubbles rising to the surface. Its parents watched from nearby, their usually quiet expressions softened with wonder. They too soon slipped into the water, and as they floated together in a small cluster, they realized that Goo Lagoon had a gift no other place had ever offered them, the gift of floating with ease. Their visit was not loud, not filled with games or shouts. Instead, it was marked by stillness, by the quiet joy of simply being carried. They spent the whole day there, barely moving, watching as the sunlight changed across the water. By evening, the starfish family had decided that Goo Lagoon was a place they would return to whenever they longed to feel both light and safe. Stories like theirs rippled outward. Families told friends, travelers told strangers, and the lagoon's reputation spread wider and wider, not through loud announcements or grand tales, but through soft conversations, whispered across the sea. It was always described the same way, gentle, welcoming, and unlike anywhere else. One afternoon, a group of jellyfish arrived. Their glowing, translucent bodies shimmered in the sun as they drifted toward the lagoon. Though jellyfish were often seen as wanderers, carried wherever the current took them, this group had chosen their path deliberately. They had heard whispers of the lagoon's calm, and they wanted to experience it for themselves. The lagoon greeted them in its usual way, patiently, quietly, without resistance. The jellyfish floated across its surface like lanterns, their soft pulses sending ripples through the water. Children playing nearby stopped to watch, their eyes wide with awe. The jellyfish glowed faintly as dusk approached, their bodies lighting up the lagoon with a soft, otherworldly glow. It was as though the lagoon had lit candles upon its waters. That night, families gathered at the shore to watch the glowing jellyfish. They didn't speak loudly, didn't crowd too close, but simply sat together, watching the gentle dance of light. The lagoon seemed to smile in its own way, reflecting the glow, stretching it further across its waters. It was a moment so serene that even the waves outside the lagoon seemed to pause. The visitors began to realize something profound. Goo Lagoon was not only a place to play, but a place to connect. Strangers met here and shared food, shared stories, and often left as friends. The lagoon created a space where defenses softened, where conversations flowed as easily as the tides. In its stillness, it reminded everyone who came that they were part of something larger, a community bound by the gentle waters they shared. Even those who came alone found companionship. A wandering crab, weary from his search for a place to belong, once stumbled into the lagoon by chance. At first, he stayed on the edges, unsure of whether he was welcome. But the lagoon has a way of easing fears. As he watched families laugh, as he listened to the soft songs sung at the water's edge, his heart began to relax. By the end of the day, children were inviting him to join in their games, and he laughed in a way he hadn't for years. The lagoon had a gift for weaving lives together. Some of the earliest friendships of Bikini Bottom were born on its sands. Families who would have passed each other by in the wide ocean now shared meals, built sandcastles together, and left behind footprints that overlapped in the same stretch of shore. The lagoon seemed to encourage this closeness, its waters carrying laughter across the surface like music, its tides pulling everyone gently toward one another. And yet, for all the joy it held, the lagoon never lost its peace. It balanced both, play and rest, laughter and stillness, like two halves of a whole. In the mornings, it was quiet, holding the world in its arms as the sun rose. In the afternoons, it sparkled with laughter, with games, with shouts carried on the breeze. And in the evenings, it returned to silence, its surface glowing softly under the first stars. The first visitors began to see themselves as keepers of the lagoon's story. They taught their children to treat its waters with respect, to never take more than they gave. They passed down tales of their first days here, how the lagoon had welcomed them, how it had changed them. These stories became as much a part of the place as the sand and the waves. For the lagoon was more than just a body of water. It was becoming a memory, a tradition, a part of who they were. And with every new visitor who stepped onto its sands, the story grew longer, deeper, richer, woven together in whispers and ripples, never rushed, never ending. As days passed into weeks and weeks into seasons, the first visitors became part of the very fabric of Goo Lagoon's being. They were no longer simply guests. They were threads woven into the lagoon's story, inseparable from its calm tides and golden sands. The old turtle often returned, moving slowly along the shoreline, his shell glinting in the soft sunlight. He had become something of a guardian in the eyes of the others. Children would gather around him as he told gentle tales of the places he had seen and the storms he had braved. His words always drifted back to the lagoon, though, as though even his long journey had been only a path leading to this one place. For the young ones, the turtle became living proof that Goo Lagoon was more than water, It was a sanctuary where even the oldest souls could feel new again. The starfish family, too, made the lagoon their second home. They began a tradition of arranging shells in circles upon the sand before every visit, believing it honored the lagoon that had given them such joy. These shell circles became symbols of welcome, left behind for the next visitors to find. Children who stumbled across them would add their own shells, expanding the circles into spirals, and the spirals into winding trails that glittered like necklaces upon the shore. With time, the tradition grew, and the lagoon's sands became adorned with patterns that told silent stories of those who had been there. The jellyfish, glowing softly as they drifted, continued to arrive with the changing seasons. Each year, they came in small groups, moving gracefully across the water. For the first visitors, their return became a signal that time was flowing, yet the lagoon remained unchanged. At dusk, when the jellyfish shimmered in the fading light, families gathered to watch, whispering their gratitude. These glowing creatures, unbothered by distance or years, seemed to promise that Goo Lagoon's peace would always remain. Even the wandering crab, who had once feared he would never find a place to belong, now walked with ease among the families who gathered there. He had built a small burrow near the edge of the sand where the tides brushed gently against his doorstep. He often shared his home with passing travelers, offering them shelter, food, or simply a story by the water. The lagoon had softened him just as it softened all who came to it. He had arrived as a stranger, but through the lagoon's embrace, he had become a friend to many. These early visitors, though few in number, left behind something lasting. They taught one another that Goo Lagoon was not a place to be claimed, but a place to be shared. It belonged to no single creature, yet it welcomed all. The traditions they started, the shell circles, the quiet gatherings at dusk, the shared meals upon the sand, were small, humble things, and yet, in their simplicity, they became the foundations of a culture, a way of life tied to the lagoon. The lagoon itself seemed to notice. Its tides shifted in rhythms that matched the visitors' needs. Some days, the waves reached farther onto the shore, as though offering more space to play. Other days, the water calmed completely, holding still so that even the smallest children could float without fear. Its glow at night sometimes seemed brighter, as though it wanted to light the path for those who stayed late upon its sands. Whether these were coincidences or something deeper, the first visitors felt certain the lagoon was alive and it cared for them. Nights at Goo Lagoon were especially treasured. As stars filled the sky above the sea, the families would gather in small circles on the sand. They built gentle fires, their flames reflected in the water like tiny suns. Stories flowed easily in this light. The old turtle's adventures, the crab's journeys, the dreams of children who wondered what lay beyond the horizon. But the greatest stories were always about the lagoon itself. Each visitor had their own tale of how it had welcomed them, how it had changed them, and together these tales formed a shared belief. Goo Lagoon was not just part of their world, it was part of their hearts. The first visitors also taught one another silence. There were evenings when no stories were told, when families simply sat together, watching the water glow with plankton, listening to the quiet lap of the tide. In those moments, the lagoon itself seemed to speak, without words, without sound, reminding them of the peace that came from stillness. Many found that these silent nights lingered in their dreams long after they had gone home. As time moved on, the first visitors began to understand that Goo Lagoon was timeless. Their children grew taller, their elders grew slower. But the lagoon remained unchanged. It became a constant, a place they could always return to no matter how much life shifted. It was there for celebrations, for quiet days, for sorrowful hearts that needed comfort, and for joyful hearts that needed space to shine brighter. And so Goo Lagoon became more than a destination. It became a tradition, passed down in whispers and in stories, a promise from one generation to the next. The old turtle often said, "The lagoon will wait for you always," and the families believed him. They taught their children to honor the water, to leave the sands clean, to listen for the lagoon's voice in the quiet of the night. By the end of those earliest seasons, the first visitors had given Goo Lagoon something precious, a purpose. It was no longer only a place of still water and glowing nights. It was a home for memories, a stage for laughter, a mirror for dreams. The lagoon had waited patiently through ages of silence, and now, with these first visitors, its true story had begun. As time passed, the quiet traditions of the first visitors began to bloom into something new. Goo Lagoon, once a place of stillness and discovery, now began to echo with the sounds of gentle laughter, playful splashes, and the soft rhythm of footsteps across its sand. It was no longer only a sanctuary for rest. It was becoming a canvas for joy. The families who had once sat in circles, whispering stories by the fire, now began to invent small games to pass the long afternoons. At first they were simple. Children would chase one another along the shoreline, their feet leaving patterns of prints in the wet sand, only for the tide to erase them moments later. It became a game in itself. Who could run the fastest before the waves washed away their trail? The laughter that followed rose into the air like music, carried on the breeze and returned to them in echoes. Others found joy in the water. The lagoon's gentle buoyancy allowed even the youngest to float with ease, so they began to form little circles, holding hands as the current rocked them. Some would close their eyes and let the lagoon carry them, pretending it was telling them where to go. Others would try to see who could float the longest without moving a single fin, giggling whenever one of them wobbled and splashed. The adults, too, discovered their own ways of play. Some would gather driftwood and tie it together with strands of seaweed, creating small rafts to lounge upon. They would drift lazily in the shallows, telling stories or simply watching the sky reflected in the water below. Others began to challenge each other with playful contests. Who could build the tallest mound of sand before it crumbled? Who could find the most colorful shells? Or who could balance on one foot the longest while the waves nudged at their ankles? The lagoon, as always, gave itself freely. It held every splash, every shout, every burst of laughter, never overwhelmed, never restless. Instead, it seemed to enjoy the energy as though the joy of its visitors was filling it with new light. Its waters sparkled brighter in the afternoons, as if smiling back at the children who played in them. Soon, traditions of play began to take root. A group of young fish once strung strands of kelp between two driftwood posts, inventing a game of tossing shells back and forth across the line. At first, it was clumsy. Shells slipped, tumbled, and sank. But over time, they grew skilled, batting the shells gracefully through the air. Others gathered to watch, cheering and clapping whenever a shell landed just right. Without realizing it, they had created one of the first games of Goo Lagoon, a simple joy that drew laughter from all who played. Another tradition was born from the sand itself. Children began building shapes, not just small towers, but castles with winding walls, tall turrets, and tiny bridges that stretched across puddles. Families would work together, smoothing the walls with careful fins, decorating the towers with shells, sea glass, and strands of dried seaweed. By evening, The shoreline often glittered with whole villages of sand glowing in the fading sun. The tide would eventually sweep them away, but that too became part of the magic. Each day offered a new beginning, a new chance to build again, to create something different, to laugh as the waves reclaimed their work. The evenings were perhaps the most cherished. After long afternoons of play, families would gather once more in small groups, sitting on the warm sand and watching the sky shift from gold to pink to deep violet. Their bodies were tired, but their hearts were full. The lagoon seemed to hush itself then, calming its waters so that even the smallest ripple moved softly. The laughter faded into quiet murmurs, and soon only the crackle of small fires and the distant song of the sea could be heard. For the first visitors, and for those who joined them in these days, Goo Lagoon became more than a destination. It became a gathering place, a place where friends met, where strangers became companions, and where even the simplest of games turned into cherished traditions. It was not the noise of the gatherings that defined it, but the gentleness with which joy was shared. The lagoon held every laugh as tenderly as it had once held silence, proving that peace and play could live side by side. So Goo Lagoon grew brighter with each day. Its sands carried footprints, its waters carried ripples of laughter, and its skies carried the voices of families who found themselves returning again and again. For in the lagoon, play was never just play. It was connection, memory, and the weaving together of lives. As the lagoon grew busier with laughter and footsteps, the games that began as small amusements slowly blossomed into rituals that everyone looked forward to. The shoreline became a stage, the water a playground, and the air above a canvas for voices and joy. What once had been the quiet retreat of a few visitors now sparkled with life, though never in a way that disturbed its peace. Goo Lagoon absorbed the sounds of play the way sand absorbs footsteps, welcoming, gentle, and fleeting. One of the earliest gatherings began with a handful of children chasing each other across the wet sand. Their laughter carried so far that others joined in, eager to share in the fun. Soon what had started as a small game of tag grew into a tradition of races along the shore. Families would cheer from the sidelines as little ones darted across the sand, their tails flicking and fins splashing, their giggles echoing into the air. Some tripped and tumbled, but the lagoon softened even that, as the cool water rushed in to soothe every fall. Over time, these races became more elaborate. Parents marked the sand with seashells to show a starting line. Friends decorated the finish line with strands of seaweed, cheering as if the whole ocean depended on who would reach it first. Yet there were no real winners or losers, for every race ended the same way, with a tumble into the water, laughter bubbling up, and the promise to run again tomorrow. The driftwood rafts that the adults once lounged upon also grew into something more. Families began to decorate them with colors from the sea. Bright coral fragments, smooth glass polished by waves, shells in spirals and stripes. They raced these rafts playfully, letting the lagoon's currents decide whose creation would drift the farthest. When a raft sank or broke apart, no one was upset. Instead, they laughed, knowing that the lagoon would carry those pieces away and return them later as treasures along the sand. The volleyball-like game, first invented by children tossing shells over a kelp rope, also blossomed. Others began to watch and join, creating larger circles, and soon the game had become a beloved tradition. The sound of shells clinking against fins or splashing into the water was as common at Goo Lagoon as the rush of the tide. Players called out cheerfully to one another, their voices blending with the cries of seabirds overhead. Even those who did not play loved to watch, laughing at the joyful chaos of shells flying and tumbling across the net. The sandcastles, too, became more elaborate with each visit. What once had been simple towers grew into sprawling kingdoms, crafted with patient hands and eager imaginations. Children carved windows into their walls, adults smoothed out grand courtyards, and families decorated the castles with seaweed flags that fluttered gently in the breeze. Some days, entire sections of the shoreline were covered with these creations, a temporary city built from nothing but sand, shells, and laughter. And though the tide always came to wash them away, the visitors saw it not as an ending, but as a promise. Tomorrow would bring new castles, new designs, new dreams shaped in sand. But the games were not only about play. They were about gathering. Strangers met while helping each other build a wall taller, or while joining in on a race. Families who had never spoken before shared food under the same umbrella, or traded shells for the perfect decoration. Goo Lagoon became a place where connections bloomed as naturally as games themselves. The lagoon's waters seemed to weave these lives together, pulling them gently into one shared rhythm. Evenings, once marked only by quiet fires and stories, now often carried echoes of the day's play. Children retold their adventures, how fast they had run, how tall their castles had been, how funny it had been when the shells splashed into the water. Parents smiled, watching their children's joy reflect in the glow of the fire. And all the while, the lagoon lay calm, its surface carrying the soft light of stars as if it, too, listened, pleased with what it had inspired. Sometimes the visitors wondered if the lagoon itself had taught them these games. After all, it had given them everything they needed: sand to build, water to float, driftwood to race, shells to toss. Perhaps the lagoon had been waiting for someone to discover these gifts. Perhaps it had been waiting for laughter to fill the air. The first visitors remembered the days of silence, when the lagoon was only a place of rest. Now, seeing their children play, hearing their friends laugh, they realized that Goo Lagoon had grown alongside them. It had shifted from solitude to community, from stillness to gentle joy. And yet it had never lost its peace. Its balance remained perfect. Quiet mornings, lively afternoons, calm evenings. It offered everything in harmony. Never too much, never too little. The lagoon was teaching them something. It showed them that joy did not need to be loud or overwhelming. It could be simple, playful, shared with friends. It showed them that community could be built not with grand gestures, but with games, laughter, and the willingness to come together. And perhaps most of all, it showed them that even when the tide erased their castles, even when the rafts sank or the shells slipped, the joy itself never vanished. It lingered in memory, waiting to bloom again the next day. And so Goo Lagoon became not only a gathering place, but a teacher. It taught lessons through play, through laughter. And those who visited carried these lessons home with them, spreading the lagoon's spirit far beyond its waters. As the days turned to weeks and the weeks into seasons, Goo Lagoon's gatherings grew richer in spirit. What began as small, spontaneous games now unfolded into larger celebrations that drew friends, families, and even curious strangers from nearby coves. The lagoon never felt crowded, for its wide embrace seemed to make space for everyone, holding each new laugh and voice like a treasure placed carefully on its calm waters. One of the first traditions to blossom was the Shell Toss Festival. What had begun as a simple game of tossing shells across a kelp rope soon became an event anticipated by all. Families would arrive early, carrying baskets filled with their smoothest, most colorful shells, collected from shores near and far. Some shells were polished by waves into perfect gleaming stones. Others were carved naturally into spirals and stars. Each one seemed to hold its own little story of the sea. The festival would begin with children playing in smaller circles, learning to toss the shells and cheering when one landed just right. Then, as the sun reached its highest point, the whole lagoon seemed to pause for the grand match. Groups formed on either side of the kelp ropes, and with playful seriousness, they tossed shell after shell. Some soared gracefully, catching the sunlight as they arced through the air, while others plopped into the water with a splash that sent everyone into laughter. But what mattered was never the score. What mattered was the cheer that rippled through the crowd with every throw, the way families leaned close to encourage each other, the way strangers clapped the children of others as though they were their own. By the time the last shell was thrown, Goo Lagoon rang with laughter, and the water seemed to shimmer brighter as though it too celebrated. Another cherished tradition emerged around the sandcastle gathering. These had once been small clusters of towers, but now entire families worked together to create grand displays. One summer afternoon, the visitors decided to connect their castles, building bridges of sand between them until a whole kingdom rose across the shoreline. Towers with seashell windows gleamed in the sun. Walls were lined with driftwood fences, and seaweed banners fluttered like royal flags. Children ran through the sandy streets, pretending to be knights or queens, while parents shaped arches and gates with patient hands. By evening, when the tide crept close and shadows stretched long, the entire community gathered to admire the sandy kingdom. They knew the water would soon reclaim it, washing towers back into the sea, and yet that made it more special. For when the waves finally rolled in, everyone stood together, watching the water dissolve their work. Instead of sadness, there was applause, as though the sea itself had been invited to play. These gatherings soon grew into what visitors lovingly called the Lagoon Festivals. They were never planned with strictness, yet somehow everyone knew when one was about to happen. Perhaps it was the way word spread in laughter, or the way the lagoon itself seemed to sparkle more brightly on certain days, as though calling its friends back. Music often became part of these festivals. Some visitors brought simple instruments, drums made of hollow shells, flutes carved from coral, even strands of seaweed that hummed softly when plucked. The songs were gentle, drifting on the breeze, weaving between laughter and the sound of the waves. Children danced barefoot in the wet sand, their reflections shimmering in the water while adults swayed, their hearts lighter than they had been in weeks. Evenings were the most magical of all. As the sun lowered into the horizon, fires flickered across the beach, casting golden light on the faces of those gathered. Families shared food, simple meals wrapped in kelp, fruits from the sea, small treats baked in shells. They ate together as one, trading bites, trading stories, and trading laughter. And when the stars appeared, so too did the storytellers. The quietest among them would find their voice by the glow of the fire, spinning tales of the sea, some true, some imagined, all beautiful. They told of creatures who lived deep in the trenches, of ancient tides that shaped the land, of stars reflected in the water as gifts from the sky. The children listened wide-eyed, their faces glowing with firelight and wonder, while even the adults leaned close, reminded that magic was not only for the young. What made these gatherings so special was their balance. Though filled with games and laughter, they never became too loud or chaotic. Goo Lagoon held everything in harmony. The laughter always softened at night, blending with the hush of waves. The games always left space for rest, for moments of silence where one could simply watch the moon glide across the water. For many, these festivals became the highlight of their lives. Some traveled far just to experience a day at Goo Lagoon, to feel the joy of playing in the sand, to hear the music drift over the water, to share food with strangers who felt like family by nightfall. Others returned again and again, their hearts tied to the lagoon as surely as the tide was tied to the moon. And yet, even in its liveliest moments, the lagoon never lost its dreamlike quality. Perhaps it was the way the water always shimmered softly, never disturbed even by the liveliest play. Perhaps it was the way the breeze carried the scent of salt and flowers, soothing even the most restless hearts. Or perhaps it was the way the lagoon seemed to hold every voice, every laugh, every song, carrying them like ripples that faded gently into peace. Whatever the reason, Goo Lagoon had become more than a place of games. It was now a place of belonging, of joy shared openly and gently. It was a home not built of walls or roofs, but of water, sand, and the unspoken promise that here, under the open sky, everyone was welcome. As the festivals and gatherings became part of the lagoon's rhythm, something deeper began to stir in the hearts of those who visited. At first, the games were simple diversions, ways to fill the long afternoons with laughter and companionship. But over time, they became more than just play. They became teachers, silent guides that reminded everyone of truths too easily forgotten in the rush of daily life. One lesson was about impermanence. Every sandcastle, no matter how grand, was destined to be carried away by the tide. Children who once wept at the sight of their towers dissolving soon learned to smile, to let go, to watch the sea take their creations, as though it were a friend borrowing them for time. Parents, too, found meaning in this. They saw how the lagoon gently taught patience, how it whispered that not everything was meant to last forever, and that beauty could be found in the fleeting. The games at Goo Lagoon were never about winners or losers. Even in the shell toss, where shells soared across kelp lines and splashed into the water, the loudest cheers were always for the smallest players, the ones who tried their hardest, even if the shell barely left their hand. The gatherings reminded everyone that joy grew larger when it was shared, that laughter was richer when it echoed between friends, and that kindness could make a stranger feel like family in a single afternoon. The lagoon also taught the value of balance. For while the days were filled with noise and motion, the nights always brought quiet. After the games were done, after the songs had faded, there was always a moment when the community would fall, gazing out at the darkened water. The stars shimmered above, reflected in the calm surface, and the whole lagoon seemed to sigh with peace. It was as though the games themselves were only half the gift. The other half was the stillness that followed, the way joy could settle softly into rest. Stories from these gatherings began to spread far beyond the lagoon itself. Travelers carried them to distant reefs and towns, speaking of a place where the water was gentle, where the sands welcomed footsteps, where laughter carried across the waves like music. Some came curious, others doubtful, but those who stayed long enough always left changed. They carried with them not just memories of games and gatherings, but a quiet sense of wonder, a reminder that life was lighter when lived with play and patience. Generations passed, and with them, new games were born. Children invented races across the tide pools, splashing through the shallow waters with gleeful shouts. Young ones created scavenger hunts for shells, sea glass, and the smooth stones polished by the waves. Adults found joy in contests of strength, pushing driftwood logs across the sand, or balancing rocks into delicate towers that seemed impossible, only to tumble back into the sand with laughter. Each new game carried the same spirit, light, fleeting, joyful. What never changed was the way Goo Lagoon held it all. The water never turned restless, even when splashes filled its shallows. The sand never grew weary of footsteps, even as festivals brought crowds. The air never stopped carrying the sound of laughter, never stopped softening it into something gentle, something restful. The lagoon was not only a stage for games and gatherings, it was a participant, a silent friend that joined in by holding every memory within its calm embrace. For many, these gatherings became more than moments of fun. They became anchors in memory. Children who grew into adults could still recall the feel of wet sand between their fingers as they built castles, or the way their parents' laughter had blended with their own during the shell toss. Adults who had once joined strangers in dancing by the fire could remember the glow of those nights decades later, the warmth of community that lingered long after the embers cooled. And even those who returned after many years found that Goo Lagoon had not changed. The water was still calm, the sand still soft, the air still filled with the same quiet magic. They might arrive older, perhaps wearier, but the moment they stepped into the lagoon's embrace, the games and laughter of the past seemed to rise again, as though waiting for them. By now, Goo Lagoon had become something more than a place of beauty. It had become a symbol, a reminder that play was not only for the young, that laughter was a kind of nourishment, and that gatherings, no matter how simple, could shape lives. It was proof that joy could exist without competition. The community could thrive without walls, and that peace could be found in the very act of being together. And so, even as time continued to flow like the tide, the games and gatherings of Goo Lagoon remained eternal in spirit. The shells tossed across kelp lines, the castles built and washed away, the songs that drifted into the night. All of it became part of the lagoon's story, a story it whispered back to every visitor willing to listen. For in the end, Goo Lagoon was never just about the games themselves. It was about what those games revealed. That the heart grows lighter when it plays, that joy deepens when it is shared, and that the simplest of moments, footprints in the sand, ripples in the water, laughter carried on the breeze, can hold the deepest kind of magic. And so, under the endless sky, with the waves that never hurried and sands that always welcomed, Goo Lagoon's legacy of games and gatherings endured. It was a legacy not written in stone, but carried in memory, carried in the gentle rhythm of tides, carried in the laughter of all who had ever set foot upon its shore. There is something timeless about the sand of Goo Lagoon. To the casual visitor, it may seem ordinary, soft grains underfoot, warm beneath the sun, cool beneath the stars. But for those who linger, those who pause and truly look, the sand tells stories. Each grain, carried by waves and shaped by years beyond counting, is a fragment of history, a memory of the sea itself. And when the visitors of the lagoon gathered in quiet moments, they began to see these stories, to hear them whispered in the shifting patterns left by the tide. At first, the stories were found in the simple imprints of life. Footsteps pressed into the sand seemed to speak of the day just lived. A child's small prints weaving in zigzags told of games and laughter. Deeper, broader marks showed where parents had walked slowly, perhaps carrying shells or gathering driftwood. Trails left by crabs or tiny sea snails wrote their own curving scripts, delicate lines that the water would gently blur by nightfall. To many, these imprints felt like words of a language they did not fully understand, a language written by life itself, fleeting yet meaningful. The children were often the first to imagine stories in these marks. They would kneel down, tracing the trails with curious fins or fingers, inventing tales of where the creatures had gone. A crab's path might become the journey of a wandering adventurer searching for treasure. A cluster of overlapping footprints might transform into a secret meeting of heroes gathering at dusk. Even the swirls made by receding waves were seen as pictures. Dragons curled in sleep, stars falling into the sea, or maps leading to lands hidden beyond the horizon. As the evening settled, families would gather by the water's edge and share these stories aloud. Parents listened to their children's inventions with patient smiles, adding small details of their own. A crooked footprint might become a sign of a giant who had passed through unnoticed. A smooth patch of untouched sand could be a doorway, left behind by ancient spirits of the sea. In this way, the lagoon's sands became more than just a surface to walk upon. They became a living canvas of imagination. But over time, some of these imagined tales began to take on the weight of legend. Visitors noticed that certain patterns returned again and again. The same curves of tide, the same clusters of shells, the same sweeping arcs left by the waves. To many, it felt as though the lagoon itself was writing its own stories, leaving gentle clues in the sand for those who wished to see. One such story told of a starfish prince, said to have left behind a trail of 5-pointed marks as he searched for a crown hidden beneath the waves. Whenever starfish were found clustered in unusual patterns, the children whispered that the prince had returned, still wandering the lagoon in search of what was lost. Another tale spoke of the moon's reflection, a silvery path that sometimes appeared in the wet sand under starlight. The elders said it was the moon leaving its mark on the earth, reminding the lagoon that even the sky loved it enough to visit. There was also the story of the driftwood guardian. Visitors claimed that sometimes, when a large piece of driftwood washed ashore and embedded itself in the sand, the marks around it looked like wings stretched wide. Children would place shells around it as offerings, believing that the guardian protected the lagoon from storms. Whether true or not, the guardian became a figure in many fireside tales, a symbol of safety in a place where the sea met the land with gentleness. The sand also carried stories that were less imagined and more remembered. Families who returned year after year began to recognize the shapes of their own traditions. A circle pressed into the sand might remind them of the fire they had gathered around the summer before. A mound left by playful digging could spark the memory of a sandcastle built long ago. The sand, though it shifted and changed with every tide, somehow held on to echoes of the past. It reminded its visitors that they too were part of the lagoon story. As the community of Goo Lagoon grew, so too did its library of stories. Children learned the old tales as if they were lullabies, passed down from parents who had once been children themselves. The starfish prince, the moon's silver path, the driftwood guardian, all became familiar characters in the lagoon's living mythology. And with each retelling, the stories grew richer, their details shifting like the sands themselves, shaped by each new voice that spoke them. What was remarkable was not whether the stories were true, but how they made people feel. They gave meaning to the simple marks of nature, turned fleeting imprints into lasting wonders. They encouraged visitors to look closely, to slow down, to see magic in the smallest of patterns, and in doing so, they deepened the connection between people and the place they loved. To walk along the sand of Goo Lagoon was to walk through memory, imagination, and legend all at once. Every step carried the weight of countless stories. Some lived, some dreamed, some whispered by the sea itself. And for those who listened carefully, the sand spoke not only of the past, but of the future too, reminding them that every footprint left behind would one day be part of the lagoon's endless tale. Over time, the stories born from the sands of Goo Lagoon became inseparable from the lives of its visitors. What began as children's imaginations and gentle whispers by the fireside slowly wove itself into the rhythm of gathering. No longer were the marks in the sand seen as random or fleeting. They were regarded as signs, gentle offerings from the lagoon itself, waiting to be discovered, cherished, and retold. Families often arrived at the lagoon with the quiet excitement of what new story the sands might reveal that day. Children would rush ahead, scanning the shoreline as though reading a freshly opened book. A series of curved wave marks might become a dragon's tail, while scattered shells were declared to be jewels from a queen's crown. Even the way the foam dried into lace-like patterns on the sand was enough to inspire entire adventures, filled with heroes, secrets, and magical journeys. The adults, too, found themselves leaning into the practice. While they once joined only to humor the children, they began to see the beauty in letting imagination take root in the smallest details. A parent might pause at the sight of a hollow in the sand, whispering that it looked like the footprint of a sea giant. Another might run their hand over smooth ridges, speaking softly about the ripples of time itself. Through these shared inventions, parents and children alike became part of something timeless, the act of weaving memory into the landscape. As these practices grew, the stories began to shape the lagoon's gatherings. Entire evenings were sometimes dedicated to story walks. Families and friends would wander slowly along the shoreline at dusk, pointing out shapes, marks, and patterns that caught their eyes. Each person would add a detail, building a shared tale as they walked. A spiral left by a shell dragging across the sand might become the path of a lost traveler. A cluster of small prints could be a band of tiny creatures escaping into the night. By the time the group returned to their fires, they carried with them a living story, told not by one voice, but by many. These walks became a beloved tradition, especially among the children, who treasured the chance to see their ideas welcomed and expanded by others. It gave them a sense of importance, of belonging to something greater than themselves. Adults, too, found comfort in these shared tales, for they reminded them of the creativity they had once known in childhood, rekindling sparks of wonder long thought forgotten. In time, visitors began to inscribe their own marks into the sand deliberately, not to alter its natural beauty, but to add their own chapters to its ever-growing book. Families drew symbols that represented their time together, circles to mark unity, spirals for journeys, stars to honor dreams. Some etched short messages, simple words of gratitude or love, knowing the tide would carry them away but leave the memory. Their impermanence was part of the gift, part of the trust that the lagoon itself would remember, even as the surface was smoothed once more. Nazan Omi. It wasn't long before the lagoon became known as a place of storytelling gathering. Strangers who arrived alone often left with a tale woven in their company. Families who once came only to play in the water now found themselves sitting in circles on the sand, inventing stories from the shapes around them. Some even traveled to Goo Lagoon for this very reason, to listen, to create, to let their imaginations mingle with the whispers of waves and the shifting of grains. The stories also found their way into the games and festivals that had already grown at the lagoon. Shell tosses sometimes carried a theme, with each team naming themselves after characters from the tales: the Starfish Prince, the Moon's Messengers, the Driftwood Guardians. Sandcastle contests grew more elaborate, with families shaping their creations into scenes from beloved legends. One castle might rise as the Starfish Prince's palace, adorned with shells shaped like crowns, while another became the towering gate of the Driftwood Guardian, decorated with wings of seaweed. At night, when the fires glowed and music drifted across the lagoon, the stories often came alive in performance. Children would act out their favorite legends, stomping across the sand as giants, twirling as sea spirits, or marching as brave adventurers. Their voices were high and clear, carrying laughter and wonder into the star-streaked sky. Adults joined too, offering deeper voices for guardians and narrators, or lending quiet songs to weave into the tale. These performances, though simple, were more magical than any grand stage could have offered, for the lagoon itself was their backdrop, shimmering in the moonlight as though nodding in approval. With each generation, the stories in the sand grew richer. What had once been small inventions became layered traditions. Tales told by grandparents were remembered by grandchildren, reshaped with new details, then told again. Some stories grew so familiar that they were spoken like prayers, simple reminders of love, protection, and belonging. Others were forever changing, as mercurial as the tide, different with each telling, yet always rooted in the lagoon's sands. What was remarkable was how these stories gave the lagoon a sense of continuity. Though the visitors changed, though time marched steadily forward, the lagoon itself felt timeless because of the legends that clung to it. Even newcomers sensed it the moment they stepped onto the sand, the feeling that they were walking on ground already rich with memory, that their presence was becoming part of something older and greater. The lagoon sands, with their shifting patterns and fleeting imprints, reminded everyone who came that stories did not need to be permanent to matter, like sandcastles, like laughter, like the glow of a single evening. They could exist for a moment and still last forever in memory. The lagoon taught that the true permanence of a story is not in its form, but in the hearts it touches, in the way it lives on in the telling and retelling across generations. And so Goo Lagoon became known not only as a place of play, but also as a place of stories. To walk its sands was to walk through imagination, history, and legend all at once, a living library that required no walls, no shelves, only the patient turning of tides and the gentle steps of those who came to listen. As the years stretched onward, the stories of Goo Lagoon began to shift. What had once been playful inventions, spun by children kneeling in the sand, slowly transformed into something deeper. They became legends, passed with reverence, shaping how visitors understood the lagoon itself. The sands no longer seemed to hold only the marks of daily life, but whispers of mysteries too large to ignore. The elders were often the keepers of these legends, their voices steady and low as they recounted tales beneath the flickering glow of evening fires. Children would press close, wide-eyed, while even the youngest adults leaned in with the quiet curiosity of those who suspected there was truth hidden within the words. One of the most beloved legends was that of the first tide. It was said that long ago, before any creature had walked the lagoon's shore, the sea itself had chosen this place as a gift for the world above. The waters, tired of their endless roaming, pulled back just enough to form the soft curve of Goo Lagoon. As the waves receded, they left behind not emptiness, but grains of sand, each grain carrying a memory of the sea. That was why the sands seemed alive, why they carried stories. They were not ordinary earth. They were fragments of ocean dreams made solid for time. Another tale spoke of the watcher in the sand. According to this legend, the lagoon itself had a guardian, invisible to the eye, but always present. It was said that when visitors walked along the shore, the sand remembered them. Their laughter, their tears, even the quiet weight of their footsteps were stored as whispers deep within the grains. And though the tide might wash away the marks, the memories remained, watched over by the unseen guardian. Many who came to Goo Lagoon believed this explained why they felt so deeply comforted there, why even a short visit left them with a sense of peace, as though someone had listened to their hearts without a word spoken. The Song of the Stars was another story often told. Visitors noticed how, on clear nights, the stars reflected so brightly in the still water that the lagoon seemed to hold the sky itself. Some said the stars were not merely shining, but singing, their voices captured in the sand as faint vibrations. If you pressed your ear close enough to the ground, it was whispered, you might hear the faint hum of starlight. Children often tried this, giggling as they lay belly down in the sand, listening hard, swearing they could hear music too soft for adults to notice. Of course, not all stories carried solemn mystery. Some were told with playful exaggeration, born from the joy of imagination. There were tales of crabs who raced across the sand so quickly they left trails like lightning bolts, of jellyfish who dipped down at night to write glowing patterns on the shore, of fish who leapt from the waves and froze in the air long enough to stamp their marks on the earth. Even these fanciful tales, though humorous, carried a gentle lesson, that the lagoon was a place where the ordinary could become extraordinary, where magic could be glimpsed in the simplest of shapes. Over time, these legends became woven into the sea itself, New visitors were told the stories as part of their welcome. Families who returned year after year passed the tales to their children, who then grew into adults and retold them to others. The lagoon was no longer simply a place to rest or play. It had become a place of meaning, where every grain of sand seemed to shimmer with myth. The impact of these legends was profound. Children grew up not only seeing the lagoon as a playground, but also as a sacred place of wonder. They learned that footprints, though temporary, were part of a larger story, and that even small acts could leave behind echoes in the sand. Adults, too, carried away a sense of reverence. To sit at Goo Lagoon was time felt softer, where stories layered over one another like waves, reminding them that their lives were part of something vast and enduring. There were even whispers that the lagoon's legends traveled far beyond its shores. Sailors spoke of hearing the song of the stars when passing near its waters at night, claiming they could feel the vibration of unseen music in their bones. Travelers who had never set foot on the sand told tales of the Watcher, insisting they had dreamed of a calm figure guarding a beach bathed in starlight. Whether these stories were truth or fancy hardly mattered. What mattered was the way they spread, weaving Goo Lagoon into the greater imagination of the sea. And yet, through all these tales, the sands remained simple and quiet. They asked for nothing, offered no proof, no denial. They simply continued their gentle work, receiving footprints, smoothing them away, shifting under the tide, always listening, always patient. The legends lived because people needed them, because the lagoon gave them permission to imagine, to hope, to believe. The more the stories grew, the more visitors understood that Goo Lagoon was not just a place. It was a living storybook, its pages written not with ink, but with sand and tide, footprints and memory. To walk its shores was to walk within a story, sometimes your own, sometimes one older than you could fathom, but always one worth carrying in your heart. As the legends of Goo Lagoon deepened, the sands themselves became almost sacred. Visitors arrived not just to swim or sunbathe, but to leave behind something of themselves, a mark, however fleeting. Some pressed shells into the wet ground, knowing the tide would take them, but believing the memory would remain. Others carved shapes with sticks, hearts, or spirals or initials, offering their stories to the grains as if to say, "Remember me even when I am gone." Over time, these small gestures formed a tradition. Families would walk to the edge of the water before leaving for home, each person placing a handprint in the sand. They would stand together for a moment, watching the water creep forward, washing over the marks, erasing them from sight. Yet in their hearts, they carried the belief that the lagoon still remembered. Children especially loved this ritual, squealing as the tide lapped at their fingers, certain that their handprint had been taken into the secret memory of the shore. The elders, who had seen many tides come and go, often spoke of this ritual with quiet reverence. They said it reminded them of life itself, that nothing we do lasts forever in the world's eyes, yet everything leaves its trace somewhere unseen. To place a handprint in the sand was not to mourn its disappearance, but to trust that it mattered, even if the evidence faded. This gentle philosophy gave comfort to many, and it was why so many returned to Goo Lagoon year after year. As the legends were told and retold, they began to weave together, forming an unbroken fabric of meaning. The first tide, the Watcher in the sand, the song of the stars, these stories did not compete, but harmonized. They suggested that the lagoon was both gift and guardian, memory and music, play and mystery. And in this harmony, visitors found peace. They did not need to decide whether the stories were true. The act of believing, even briefly, was enough. On quiet nights, when the crowds had long since gone home and only the sigh of waves remained, Goo Lagoon seemed to confirm its own mythology. The water would shine silver in the moonlight, the sand would hum with a soft stillness, and the stars would cast their reflections so clearly that one could believe the sky itself had descended to rest upon the earth. To walk along the shore in those hours was to feel part of something both ancient and eternal. It was easy to imagine the watcher listening nearby, or to hear a faint note of star song beneath the breeze. Travelers who stayed until dawn often spoke of the morning sands. Just as the first rays of sunlight touched the beach, the ground seemed to sparkle, dew catching the light in a way that made every footprint glow before vanishing. Many believed this was the lagoon's way of blessing the stories left from the day before, giving them a final brilliance before letting them go. It was a sight that lingered in the memory, and those who saw it often carried the vision for the rest of their lives. The children of Bikini Bottom grew up with these stories in their ears and hearts, and as they became adults, they found themselves retelling them almost unconsciously. A simple walk on the sand could stir the urge to share a memory, to recall a legend, to pass it along. In this way, the stories in the sand did what stories always do. They connected generations, weaving together past and present, play and reverence, imagination and truth. There were some who argued, of course, that the stories were nothing more than fancy, that sand was sand, that tides were tides, and nothing more. Yet even those skeptics often returned to Goo Lagoon, and when they did, they found themselves lingering longer than expected, listening a little more closely to the quiet, and sometimes even pressing their palms into the wet ground before leaving. Perhaps they did not believe fully, but they felt something nonetheless, something too subtle to explain, but too powerful to ignore. In the end, that was the secret of Goo Lagoon's stories. They did not demand belief. They asked only to be heard, to be held for a moment, like a seashell against the ear. Whether one chose to call it legend, imagination, or truth, the effect was the same. The lagoon gave its visitors a sense of being part of a story greater than themselves. And so the sands continued their work. With each tide, they received new footprints, new marks, new whispers. They held them for a while, then let them go, always making space for more. Just as the waves never ceased their rhythm, so too did the stories never cease, always changing, always renewing. By the time the day came to an end, and the last visitors had drifted away, Goo Lagoon rested in silence once more. The sands, smooth and glowing under the starlight, looked untouched. Yet those who had walked there knew better. They knew that every laugh, every handprint, every whispered hope had joined the countless tales layered deep within the earth. The lagoon did not need to shout its stories. It carried them quietly, patiently, forever. And so Goo Lagoon became not just a place of water and sand, but a living library, its shelves built of tides, its pages written in footsteps, its words whispered by the wind. Every creature who set foot upon its shore became both reader and writer, participant in an endless story written not in ink, but in the shifting, shimmering sands of time. There comes a time in every day at Goo Lagoon when the rhythm slows, when the air itself seems to hush, and the light begins its gentle transformation. This is the hour when the sun drifts toward the horizon, and the lagoon prepares to wrap itself in the golden embrace of evening. For all the stories told in its sands, for all the games and laughter that fill its daylight hours, it is perhaps during sunset that Goo Lagoon reveals its most breathtaking truth, that even endings can feel like beginnings, and that the closing of the day is as much a gift as its dawn. This shift begins quietly, almost unnoticeably. The bright blue of the sky softens into a warmer shade, and the water, which has sparkled with silver light all day, takes on a more reflective calm. The waves roll in, as they always do, but their edges gleam with hints of orange and pink, as if the sea itself were catching fire in slow motion. Sand, which only hours earlier felt playful and sunlit, now glows with a gentler warmth, holding the fading light like an ember. Families gather their belongings, shaking off towels and folding umbrellas, yet their movements are slower now. Even children, who had run tirelessly between the shore and the water, pause to watch the changing colors. There is something magnetic about the way the sky deepens, drawing every gaze toward the horizon where the sun lingers like a lantern about to dim. The voices of the crowd soften into murmurs, laughter giving way to a quieter joy, as if everyone collectively agrees that this moment is worth more silence than sound. Some sit in the sand, digging their toes into its coolness, while others remain standing, arms wrapped loosely around themselves, as the breeze carries the salty scent of evening. Couples walk along the shoreline, their footprints trailing behind, while older visitors lean against driftwood or rocks, gazing out, as though they are watching not just the sunset, but a memory of every sunset they have ever known. It is during this time that Goo Lagoon seems to take on a personality all its own. The lagoon is no longer merely a playground or gathering place. It is a mirror of the sky, a vast canvas on which the day paints its final masterpiece. The water reflects every hue in layered brilliance, gold near the horizon, deepening into crimson, then melting into soft purples and blues. The effect is so complete that it feels as though you are standing not on sand, but in the heart of a painting that shifts with every passing minute. As the colors bloom, they awaken stories of their own. Children often point at the water, insisting they see shapes in the reflection. A jellyfish made of clouds, a starfish outlined in orange light, or the silhouette of a great sea creature rising from the depths. Parents smile at these imaginings, but they too feel the enchantment, remembering the stories once told about the lagoon's mysteries. Some even whisper that the watcher in the sand is most present during sunset, when the air is thick with memory and the sands seem to glow from within. Birds contribute their part to the performance, gliding low over the waves before returning to their nests. Their wings catch the light as they pass, flashes of brilliance against the darkening horizon. The sound of their calls blends with the surf, creating a lullaby that belongs only to this hour. It is neither the noise of day nor the silence of night, but something between, a transitional music that feels like a gift to those lucky enough to hear it. The tide, too, begins its slow shift. As the sun lowers, the water creeps higher on the shore, claiming the day's footprints one by one. Each mark, each memory pressed into the sand, is washed gently away, leaving behind a smooth surface that gleams in the last rays of light. Watching this ritual, visitors often feel a sense of closure. The erasure is not harsh, but tender, as though the lagoon is saying, "Thank you. I will keep this story safe. Now rest." And in the sky, the sun itself begins its descent in earnest. At first, it is a glowing disk, bold and unyielding. But with every passing minute, its edges soften, and it sinks lower, bathing the world in a warm, amber glow. Shadows stretch long across the sand, growing darker as the horizon ignites. The final moments before the sun disappears are the most mesmerizing. The light seems to shimmer on the surface of the water, dancing like fire before slipping beneath the line where sea and sky meet. As soon as it vanishes, a hush falls over Goo Lagoon. Though twilight follows, though stars soon awaken, the instant of the sun's farewell carries a power that stirs the heart. It is a reminder of endings, yes, but also of cycles, of the promise that the sun will rise again tomorrow to bathe the lagoon in new light. The calm that lingers afterward is not sorrowful, but serene, a deep, abiding peace that wraps around every visitor like a soft blanket. For many, this is the moment they treasure most. The chance to sit with the lagoon, not in noise or laughter, but in stillness, watching as the world shifts gently toward night. It is the hour of reflection, when stories told during the day settle like grains of sand, and when hearts, no matter how busy or restless, find themselves slowed by the rhythm of the sea. For some, the beauty of Goo Lagoon's sunset lies not just in the sky or the water, but in the way it transforms the people who witness it. The sunset seems to slow every heart, creating a shared moment that belongs equally to families, lovers, friends, and strangers alike. Each visitor experiences the glow differently, and yet somehow all those experiences blend into a single harmony. Families often gather close as the day draws to an end. Parents spread out blankets and coax tired children to sit beside them, offering snacks saved for this quiet moment. The little ones, who only hours ago had raced endlessly across the beach, now lean sleepily against their parents, watching the shifting light with heavy eyes. Their laughter fades into whispers, and though they may not fully understand the magic of what they're seeing, they feel its weight. Many parents find themselves reflecting during this time, grateful for the memories made, for the simple joy of togetherness under such a sky. They know that one day their children will grow older, and that these evenings, these golden, fleeting moments, will become cherished memories carried far into the future. Children, for their part, often imagine the sunset as something alive. They might point at the horizon and declare that the sea is drinking the sun like juice, or that the sky is painting itself before bedtime. Some insist that the colors are messages from mermaids, each streak of pink or gold, a word written in a secret language. Others ask endless questions: why the water looks like glass, why the sun grows bigger as it falls, why the stars wait so patiently to appear. Parents answer with smiles, sometimes with stories, sometimes simply with silence, letting the children create their own truths. The sunset at Goo Lagoon encourages such wonder, reminding all who see it that imagination has a place even in the closing hours of the day. The elders, too, find their own meaning in the sunset. For them, the glow often stirs old memories, days long past when they themselves were children, or when they brought their own families to these shores. Sitting in the warm light, they feel time folding around them, as though every sunset they've ever watched is layered into this one. They see not just the fading sun, but the passage of years, the way life itself mirrors the tide, always advancing, always retreating, always returning anew. Many elders describe sunset at Goo Lagoon as a gentle teacher, offering lessons in acceptance. The day is ending, yes, but it ends beautifully, and in that beauty is comfort. Then there are the solitary wanderers, those who come alone, seeking quiet or escape. They walk along the shore with bare feet, letting the water lap softly at their ankles as the sky burns with color. For them, sunset is not about sharing, but about listening, about being present with their own thoughts. Some find solace in the rhythm of the waves, realizing that even as their lives feel tangled or uncertain, the sea remains steady, eternal. Others feel inspired, their minds filling with words or dreams as though the horizon were inviting them to chase something beyond their current reach. The solitude of sunset does not feel lonely here. Instead, it feels like a conversation with something larger than oneself, something that does not need to speak to be understood. Couples, unsurprisingly, are drawn to the lagoon during this hour. They sit close together, hands intertwined, watching the sky melt into shades of rose and violet. The glow reflects in their eyes, and many believe the lagoon itself blesses their bond with its beauty. Some exchange quiet promises. Others share unspoken feelings in the simple act of being together, bathed in golden light. The sunset is a reminder of tenderness, of the way love can feel eternal in a single moment. Goo Lagoon has seen countless beginnings written to its sunsets. First kisses, heartfelt confessions, vows whispered beneath the shifting sky. Artists, too, are often found here during the sunset hour, sketchbooks or instruments in hand. Painters try desperately to capture the shifting palette of colors before it fades, each stroke a race against the sinking sun. Writers jot quick lines, metaphors tumbling onto the page like waves breaking on shore. Musicians strum quietly, their notes carried on the evening breeze, blending with the natural rhythm of the sea. For them, Goo Lagoon is not just a place of rest, but a muse, endlessly offering inspiration. And though their works may never fully capture the perfection of a sunset, they are grateful for the attempt, for the way the glow ignites something within. No matter how each visitor experiences it, the sunset has a unifying power. Strangers who have never spoken find themselves standing side by side, gazes locked on the same horizon, sharing silence without awkwardness. The usual boundaries of difference, age, background, worries, fade as the sky deepens. For those brief minutes, all are simply witnesses to beauty, gathered in the same place, connected by the same awe. As the light fades further, the first stars begin to appear. The crowd, once enchanted by the sky, now shifts its attention to the water, where the lagoon mirrors both the fading glow of the sun and the emerging twinkle of the heavens. It feels as though two worlds, day and night, sea and sky, are meeting in the lagoon's calm surface. To many, this is the most sacred moment of all, the instant when everything seems balanced, when opposites coexist in harmony. And still, the lagoon remains steady, its waves rolling in and out as they always have. It does not rush the sunset, does not cling to the light, does not resist the coming dark. It simply allows the day to end in beauty, teaching all who stand upon its sands the quiet art of letting go. If the people who gather at Goo Lagoon during sunset bring their own reflections and meanings, the lagoon itself seems to participate as well. It is not just a backdrop for beauty, it feels alive, as though every element of the place is aware of the day's closing act. The sand, the water, the wind, even the air itself, each plays a part in the quiet theater of dusk. The sand, first and foremost, undergoes a striking transformation. Throughout the day, it holds the brightness of the sun, warm beneath bare feet, golden and playful. But when the sun begins to lower, the grains take on a subtler glow. The once sharp brightness softens into warm hues, peach, rose, amber, until it seems the ground itself is made of tiny embers, each particle catching the last light of the day. Visitors walking barefoot often pause, looking down in surprise, as though the earth is glowing for them alone. And when shadows stretch long across the shore, they carve rivers of purple and blue across the glowing surface, creating a natural painting that shifts with every passing second. The tide, too, carries its own message. As the day fades, the water grows calmer, as if matching the slower rhythm of the world around it. The waves arrive more gently, brushing the shore with a sound like a soft exhale. During the bright hours, the tide had been playful, tumbling children and tugging at swimmers. But now, at sunset, it becomes tender, almost protective, rolling in with the mother's hush, smoothing away the day's footprints. Watching this, it is easy to believe the stories told in the earlier hours, that the tide listens, that it remembers, that it offers closure by washing away the surface while holding the essence beneath. Sometimes in the stillness, the water reflects the colors of the sky so perfectly that it is hard to tell where sea ends and heaven begins. Gold melts into crimson, crimson into violet, violet into indigo, until the surface looks like glass colored by fire. Those who gaze long enough begin to feel as though they are not simply looking at water, but peering into another world. One where every color carries meaning, one where silence speaks. Children call it the Rainbow Sea, while elders nod quietly, knowing it is more than beauty they see. It is memory, reflection, and promise woven into a single surface. The wind also seems to change its tune at this hour. In the heat of midday, it had carried laughter, splashes, and the chatter of crowds. By evening, however, it becomes gentler, cooler, whispering across the sand like a storyteller lowering its voice. It brushes through hair, tugs at loose fabric, and slips between seashells, creating soft, whistling notes. To some, the wind at sunset feels like a farewell kiss, the day's final caress. To others, it carries messages, an encouragement perhaps, or a reminder, a subtle nudge that tomorrow will come just as surely as today. Even the air itself feels different. The warmth of the sun still lingers faintly, but beneath it, there is a coolness that hints of night. Breathing it in, visitors often describe a freshness that seems to clear away the heaviness of the day. The air smells of salt and seaweed, yes, but also of something less tangible. Possibility, perhaps, or hope. It is the kind of air that makes you inhale deeply, as though filling your lungs with light itself. Together, these elements create the sense that Goo Lagoon is not passive during sunset, but active, alive, aware, almost ceremonial. The lagoon participates in its own way, offering beauty not as an accident, but as a gift. The glowing sand, the reflective tide, the whispering wind, the cleansing air, they combine into a harmony that feels intentional, as though the lagoon knows that this is the moment everyone waits for. It is no wonder, then, that so many speak of Goo Lagoon as a place of renewal. Standing on its shores as the sun sinks, one cannot help but feel part of something larger. Worries that seemed heavy in the morning feel lighter now, softened by the glow. Joys that felt fleeting become etched more deeply, remembered not only in hearts but in the sands themselves. The lagoon seems to hold it all, grief and laughter, beginnings and ending, transforming them into something beautiful as the day concludes. And always there is the horizon. That line where sky and water meet becomes the stage for the sun's final bow. As the glowing orb lowers, it paints the clouds in colors too complex to name, shades of coral, lavender, and copper all blending seamlessly. The horizon becomes a reminder that beauty does not cling to permanence. It arrives, dazzles, and fades, leaving behind only memory. And yet, in that fading, it promises return. In those last few minutes before the sun disappears, Goo Lagoon seems to hold its breath. The waves grow quieter still, the birds fall silent, and even the wind pauses. Visitors feel it too, the collective awareness that this is the peak, the climax of the day's story. Then slowly, the sun slips beneath the horizon, and a soft sigh seems to ripple through the world. It is over, yet not gone. It has simply turned the page, preparing for tomorrow. As the last traces of sunlight slip beneath the horizon, Goo Lagoon enters a new kind of beauty. The world does not end with the sun's departure. It transforms. The brilliance of gold and crimson melts into softer shades of twilight, and the lagoon takes on a deep, reflective calm. It is as though the entire day has exhaled, leaving behind a silence that feels sacred. The first stars appear, shy at first, then bolder, one after another. Their light glimmers faintly on the water's surface, tiny sparks scattered across a sea of darkening blue. Visitors who remain often point to them, whispering to one another as though raising their voices might disturb the fragile wonder. The stars, mirrored perfectly in the lagoon, seem to double in number, until it feels as though the shore itself has become a second sky. Children, bundled in towels or wrapped in their parents' arms, look upward with wide eyes. To them, the stars are stories waiting to be told, shapes of fish, crabs, or jellyfish, traced in constellations above. Elders smile knowingly, remembering that they once saw the same shapes when they were small. In that shared gaze between generations, Goo Lagoon binds the past and the present together, reminding all who linger that beauty is not lost in time. It is renewed each night, written fresh across the heavens. The water, once ablaze with fire, now rests in tranquility. Its surface darkens into indigo, broken only by the silver streaks of starlight and the pale glow of the rising moon. The tide continues its steady rhythm, carrying with it the last fragments of the day's stories. Each wave whispers against the shore, a soft repetition that sounds almost like a lullaby. Hush, hush, hush. The lagoon no longer plays, it comforts, its presence a quiet hand resting gently upon the heart. Even the sand changes character in this final act. What had glowed with warmth during sunset now takes on a cooler shimmer, reflecting moonlight like powdered glass. Footprints made in the last light of day appear faintly silvered before the waves erase them. To walk the shore at night is to feel as though one is walking upon stardust scattered by unseen hands. Those who stay long enough often describe the experience as dreamlike, as though Goo Lagoon itself has slipped into slumber and invited them to share in its rest. The air is cooler now, carrying the fragrance of salt more sharply. The breeze no longer teases or tells stories, it soothes. It wraps around shoulders, lifting hair, guiding tired eyes toward the horizon where the last blush of sunset fades into the velvet of night. Breathing deeply, visitors feel a calm settle into their bones, a deep quiet that lingers long after they leave the shore. Some remain sitting in the sand until the beach is nearly empty, reluctant to let go of the lagoon's spell. They listen to the rhythm of the waves, the faint calls of distant seabirds returning to their nests, and the gentle rustle of the wind. For them, Goo Lagoon at night is not emptiness, but fullness. The fullness of stillness, of being small beneath the vast sky, of realizing that endings are not to be feared, but embraced. It is in this hour that many reflect most deeply. The sunset, with its brilliance, had dazzled their eyes, but the twilight touches something quieter, the heart. They remember the day's laughter, the games played in the sand, the stories whispered at midday, the legends that spoke of guardians and tides. They realize that they too are part of those stories now. Every footprint, every gaze at the horizon, every breath taken beneath the glow of the sky is part of Goo Lagoon's living memory. And so, as the final glow of sunset gives way fully to night, Goo Lagoon continues to hold its visitors gently, as it has for countless ages. The day has ended, but in its ending lies beauty, renewal, and peace. The lagoon does not mourn the loss of light. It welcomes the quiet gift of darkness, knowing that tomorrow the sun will rise again, and the cycle will begin anew. For those who depart, carrying their towels and bags up the shore, the memory of the sunset lingers long after their feet leave the sand. They glance back one last time at the darkened water, at the stars shimmering above and below, and they know they have witnessed something rare. Goo Lagoon is not just a place to swim, to play, or to rest. It is a place that teaches quietly, wordlessly, that life is as much about endings as it is about beginnings, and that both can be beautiful. As the night deepens, the lagoon falls fully into stillness. The waters reflect the moon, calm and silver. The sands, smooth and untouched once more, wait patiently for tomorrow's footprints. And the stories, the countless stories of the day, settle into the grains, joining those of yesterday, ready to whisper again when dawn returns. Goo Lagoon sleeps, but its memory does not. It holds everything, the laughter of children, the quiet thoughts of wanderers, the whispered legends of elders, the warmth of the sunset glow. It keeps them safe, woven to its tides, written in its sand, reflected in its waters. And in doing so, it ensures that no day truly ends here. It only becomes part of an endless story that continues with every sunrise, every tide, every sunset glow.